Hello, everybody. I am stoked to welcome back Karl Sakas, the operations and process person extraordinaire that we interviewed probably about a year ago now. And we're just so keen to have you back to talk more. So welcome, Karl.
Glad to be here. Glad to be back.
Excellent. So today we're going to be talking about thriving through a continuing COVID. I know we were all hoping it would be in the past by now, but it's not. So more specifically, we're going to be talking about how agencies have been affected by COVID, now that we're 6-7 months in, what sorts of things that they've kind of shifted to thrive during that time. But before I get into that, I'm curious, Karl, what would you say your superpower is?
My superpower is around active listening, asking the right questions to help people share what they need to share, to help us get to the bottom of solving whatever challenge they're struggling with, or sometimes if people just need to be heard. Yeah, so it's active listening.
Oh, that is an answer that is very much close to my heart because I believe that we're kind of socially trained to wait for our chance to speak as opposed to actually help people feel heard. Solving problems, forming connections, basically everything that goes into running a successful business or having a successful life kind of comes back to helping people feel heard, understanding what the core issue is. So anyway, I just shared why I think it's important, but I'm curious, in your own words, why does the world need what you do?
Well, my work focuses on helping agencies grow profitably. And so, beyond maybe the world as a whole, if we look at people who own independent agencies, people often start the agency because they love the work. They love design or development or writing or strategy. And suddenly they add more people to help out and they're now running an agency. They're often an accidental agency owner. Or maybe they started things intentionally and things have been a bit more involved than they expected. In my case, I've worked with hundreds of agencies all over the world, and I help people find ways to grow profitably based on their unique, call it your VGRs, your values, goals, and resources.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that the world really needs what you do because you help leaders who maybe either weren't intending to run a full agency or who feel overwhelmed at the agency they found themselves in, really align the way it functions with the life and the values and the goals that they have, basically the way they want to live. Is that
Exactly.
a right ballpark?
As business owners, we're very lucky that we can craft a lot of our day-to-day life and where we want to go. Certainly more control over that than employees. And so, life's too short to not create the agency you want. Consider also that for most independent agency owners that I work with, the agency is their number one or number two financial asset, either putting out six-figure compensation every year or potentially more. And if they choose to selling for a payday in the future, if this is your primary asset, if your agency is that important to you, you want to get it right. So I feel lucky that I can help people make that happen.
Yeah, this resonates so strongly for me as someone who is not an accidental agency owner in the sense that it was really important to me to build a team and I did so quite intentionally. I still sometimes, if I'm just being totally candid, especially in the last, 6-7 months, which have just been challenging, sometimes I find myself asking, am I really cut out for this type of work? Am I really cut out? Is this really serving me in the way that I want it to? Because when you're stuck in the messy middle, even if you have clear values and goals and stuff, it can still get overwhelming. So I'm really grateful that you're here doing this work because someone who can guide us through that messy middle, I think is, just extremely important.
And certainly to normalize things, I mean, say for your experience, you are not alone in experiencing that. And for everyone who's listening, if you're feeling overwhelmed, that's totally normal right now. And there's some things you can do to work through that. So, glad to dig in. Where do you recommend going next?
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that and how to kind of tackle that overwhelm and burnout. I think that's a really big issue for a lot of people right now. I know for me, for sure. But before we get into that, I'd like to kind of dig a little bit into your knowledge and experience with so many different agencies. And instead of talking about solutions, I do want to dig a little bit into the challenges we're facing. So
Yeah.
what are some of the issues that you're seeing agency owners face right now, primarily due to COVID? And especially, how is that different from back in like March, April, when this was all very like new and scary? I mean, still kind of scary, but
Still scary. The good news is that, thinking back in March or April, most agencies were reporting that their pipeline had stopped completely.
Mm,
That prior sales conversations, their prospective clients went blank, went dark, or, were like, well, let's talk again in the future. So ultimately, clients were choosing to stop spending money. The good news is that agencies' clients are spending money again, not necessarily at the same levels, but from my work with agencies, many report that they're doing better than ever before. Others are reporting that things are starting to get better. There are some agencies in certain sectors, for instance, travel and tourism, that continue to struggle, and at this point have usually pivoted their services somewhat around
yeah.
their focus. But I also have some insights from the CMO mastermind group that I run. So these are brand side chief marketing officers, other top marketers, and that I run through a nonprofit. And back earlier this year, in April and in May, they were reporting that their pipelines had stopped too. Their customers
Mhm.
weren't buying, especially B2B and also B2C, seeing a cutback. So agencies saying, why aren't my clients buying? Well, their clients were also saying, why aren't our customers buying, right? From an empathy standpoint, very, very similar situation. Good news, I recently did a survey within the CMO group, and nearly half the CMOs report that things have recovered or even doing better than before.
Awesome.
47% reported that things are starting to turn around, and a very small remainder said that things are bad and don't seem to be getting any better.
Mhm.
So for everyone listening, if you haven't seen a turnaround, it's likely coming, and things are generally better now than they were in March or April.
Okay.
Depending on the agency, they may not be amazing. For some, it is. Yeah.
Okay, so basically what I'm hearing is that back in March, April, everyone kind of froze, and that was trickling fully down. Basically, it was one company's clients have frozen, so now they're freezing because they can't afford to pay for the services they were going for, and it was a total freeze. Now
Yeah.
what I'm hearing is that even though the situation is still ongoing, looks very different from place to place, most businesses have, most agencies, to be more specific, that
Yeah.
you yourself have observed and worked with, are starting to bounce back. If they were in a really, really bad place, they've kind of pivoted, or, they've actually bounced back quite a bit and are seeing that things have gotten better. So overall, things are getting better, but they're not really at the point that they were before. And I'm curious whether you see, I know there's lots of talk of kind of like a recession and et cetera. I think that's pretty much inevitable at this point.
Right.
Where do you see that going in the future beyond just, we're the recession rhetoric that we keep hearing?
And I mean, in terms of recession, I had written about preparing your agency for the next recession back in May of 2019. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember worrying at the time if the article was going to be too late. Well,
Mm.
it wasn't, I guess.
Nope.
In retrospect, fortunately so. But some of the actions I talked about like building your cash reserves and making sure you're building out your staple services, things that are closer to revenue for your clients rather than
Mm-hmm.
sort of nice to have. If you didn't do that before, you're doing some of that now. Some agencies continue to struggle. It is worth looking at, how can you serve your clients? Your clients are scared. What can you do to position your agency as someone who's there to help them? Especially if clients have had layoffs, agencies can often step in to provide supplemental help even if it might be more implementation oriented. I've got my think, teach, do model about agency services. It might be more about do rather than think, which is strategy. It may not be quite as much fun to do, but if people need help, I think you need to meet your clients where they are.
Where they are. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And kind of on this same topic, I think that, I think that the idea of maybe having to do a little bit more makes sense, because what I'm seeing all across the board is exhaustion, so to speak. It's that everyone's uncertainty is turned up. Everyone's a little bit more on edge. Here on the West Coast, we have had gray, smoky skies for the last little while. There's people who are experiencing fire and having to be evacuated. Like, there's a lot of different stuff going on. And what we've observed is definitely the more we can do for the people that we're supporting, rather than just, suggest, the more we can kind of help with that overwhelm a little bit by taking a little bit more off of their plates. That being said, though, this leads me into, I think, a really important and relevant topic that you've already touched upon, which is overwhelm and burnout. We've experienced this within my team. We've got quite a bit going on right now, actually. And everyone on the team is kind of supporting each other in avoiding burnout as much as possible. But there's a point where we're all kind of overwhelmed and we're all kind of struggling with it. I know as someone with ADHD, I'm very, very prone to burnout, and I tend to burn out at a rate of like 2 or 3 times as much as the other people on my team.
Wow.
So it's brutal, and I'm working on it. But I'm curious, in these times, if your tendency is like me or like us to kind of double down and go hard, but the situation isn't quite ending, what are some of the means that you suggest to minimize that overwhelm and burnout when, the pandemic isn't stopping anytime soon?
One solution is to look at the book Meltdown from a couple years ago, Why Our Systems Fail and What to Do About It. And in their analysis, they look at things like nuclear meltdowns and major accidents and things like that. And they identify that there are certain high-risk situations. And if you dig into it, if you were to simplify it, complex systems are more likely to fail than simple systems, right? The more moving parts, the harder it is to operate, and the more likely it is to fail. To an extent, there are limits to how much we can reduce complexity. Agencies are complex. The
Especially
work we
with the
do is
team.
complex. Exactly. Add humans that makes things even more complex. The thing that you could have more success from an impact perspective is around what we think of as coupling. So if things are tightly coupled, each of the steps are closely linked to each other. Whereas if it's loose coupling, there's a bit of a gap in between each step. Imagine if you were going on a trip and you were flying, imagine, you might not be flying today, but if you have a 45-minute connection, if even one thing goes wrong on the first leg, you might miss the flight. On the other hand, if it's a 3-hour connection, you've got that extra padding. So I would say look for ways to loosen the coupling, that is to increase the padding. So for instance, in the past, maybe you'd have one person proofread things. Maybe you want to have 2 people proofread things, or depending on the circumstances. And it's worth considering that adds time, and it adds more steps. But if everyone's stressed out and they're worried not just about the work, but the world in general, and even their personal safety, it makes sense to add those steps. And that's actually part of why I fired one of my clients earlier this year.
Okay.
I had learned that the owner of the agency, I was coaching a couple of the directors of the agency, that the owner was actually expecting faster turnaround from the team as the pandemic was starting. One thing that normally would be like 3 business days, he was demanding it in 2 hours.
Oof.
Now is the time.
Yeah.
Now is the time to dial back to a point, rather than turn up the pressure, because people are already under enough pressure. If you make the pressure even stronger, you're guaranteed to have problems. So, that was indicative of a few things. There were some other factors there as well, but ultimately it's like, that's not a business that I felt comfortable supporting in terms of their values around how they chose to operate.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm actually really loving this concept and the way you put it. And I'll confess, I wasn't sure how you were going to answer this question. And the analogy that you made, basically, as I understand it, put my own active listening skills into practice
Yeah.
here, is that when things are very tightly coupled together and there isn't really a lot of wiggle room around it, especially if it's in a complex system where there's a lot of those things,
Yeah.
you really have a huge margin for error, because one little thing goes wrong, it will just basically go down the line. The immediate example that comes to mind is that driving instructor that I was close friends with a little while ago suggested to me that whenever you're in basically a line of cars, to leave a car length in between you and the next car, because if something were to happen, the chain stops with that. Basically,
Right.
Someone were to rear end you, you'll move forward, and instead of the entire line of cars being rear-ended, you get rear-ended, but hey, the 1 or 2 or 20 cars ahead of you aren't going to go through that same experience. So what I'm hearing is that this concept is fairly similar. If you add some padding around things, whether that looks like maybe adding a little bit of time to your timeline, whether that looks like having extra support nets, basically, for if something falls through the cracks, like having an extra person proofread. What this does is it allows issues, which are naturally going to come up anyway, to get found quicker and to impact less. So rather than kind of like denying that there's a problem or putting more pressure on people to just do better, what I'm hearing is that basically it's important to embrace that everyone's under a little bit of pressure right now. Things may take a little bit longer, more mistakes might be made, and let's plan for that as opposed to hoping it won't happen or planning to avoid it, if that makes sense.
A way to think about it would be, if you take time to plan for the expected, you'll have time to improvise the unexpected. And there will always be unexpected things. In my executive coaching work, so that's helping a mix of advice and accountability for agency leaders, goals to make continued forward progress. I'll help each client set SMART goals, specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, time-bound, every month, that are moving them toward their long-term goals. It's what's doable in a month or in a few weeks to move forward. And a client had set a goal for something to be due, on a Tuesday. And we'd already padded things a bit to get it done, but something else had blown up and something that needed more attention than that original goal. And so I reached out and suggested that he would extend the deadline, extend it in advance, because this other thing had come up. He knew, that would happen. And so he's like, well, I think I'll still get it done on Tuesday, but let's push it out to the end of the week. Well, I got an update due to an unexpected family medical issue. Don't worry, they're okay. You know what? Their whole Tuesday got wiped out, and his comment was, "I'm glad that I extended it." No one could have predicted that specific situation, but it needed his attention, and we all have things that come up. So padded, and the obvious agency example is, the internal team says we'll have it done this day. Probably tell the client that it'll be due a day after that, or even 2 days later, because the client will always be happy to get it sooner. They will not be happy if something blows up and it takes longer.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me and is very valuable advice for me in particular, because I know that one of the forms of neurodivergence that I have is that I'm time nearsighted. I think a lot of entrepreneurs can probably relate to me on this, where in my head, I'm like, well, of course we can get it done within this period of time. Of course we can blank, because in my head, it's 100% true. And then I back up. So what I'm hearing is that, and thankfully I have a team to support me in not doing these things, but what I'm hearing is that even a means of creating more space might be, okay, well, instead of committing to that deadline now, let me take a few minutes, talk to the team, and get back to you within 24 hours or something like that.
That is a great solution. And the nice thing there is that you can always say, I think that'll probably work. Let me talk to the team and I'll confirm. Clients don't necessarily, it depends on the client. They just want to know that things are moving forward, and they want to know that they'll have an answer, tomorrow or Monday or whatever. And, I mean, they'd rather have a for sure answer. Also, by saying things like, let me check with my project manager, or let me check with the team, that helps reinforce to your clients that it's not just you, that you've got a team supporting you and supporting them. That's helpful for anyone listening who's like, I keep doing client work forever and it feels like I can never get away. Start talking about your team. You're going to start planting the idea that there are other people involved and that you don't necessarily have all the answers yourself, because you shouldn't need all the answers yourself. You've got a team.
Yeah, I agree with that 150%. I know when I was first, especially when I started delegating projects, and then and then again, maybe a year later when I started delegating sales, I had a lot of fear around that, and a lot of fear that people would push back and be like, well, why can't I get an answer now, or get your specific time, or etc. Right. And the power of this, my mentor at the time basically suggested that. I have this very strong tenet that comes from permaculture, which is the problem is the solution. And I think it's just as applicable here as it is in many other situations. If you're afraid of them thinking that, your team isn't as capable or something as you, actually put that forward. Like, I actually will say flat out, I'll be like, look, my team is going to have same thing. I'll kind of bring up the team and mention it quite casually. And I will just confidently say, okay, so next steps are I'm passing you off to this team member. I'm going to be honest, if I were the one handling everything, that wouldn't give you the best results, like that's why I have a team to support me. And that willingness to be vulnerable, I found to be extremely powerful, even though it's scary sometimes.
It is scary. I mean, that's part of the challenge of running a business, right? That, we are the final decision maker. In a sense, I've written about the idea that you are the dictator of your agency. Whatever you say goes, as long as it's not illegal or unethical. There are, of course, consequences. If you press your team to do something that maybe you shouldn't, or with clients, like team members will leave, clients will leave, there are consequences to our actions. But ultimately, we're the final decision maker, for better or for worse.
Oh yeah. And that, especially when you have a team that will just like follow you and take you at your word and stuff, that can create just an itty bitty little bit of pressure.
Yeah. And one of the things to consider for your hiring and for everyone listening as you're hiring people, there's a concept that I got from one of my team members. It's the idea of intelligent disobedience. And I'm in the midst of hiring, and I actually put that in the job posting. So the idea of intelligent disobedience comes from training guide dogs who are supporting people. And one of the ideas is that, for instance, the individual who owns the dog is like, I want to cross the street. The dog might be thinking, there's a car coming. Like they can't hear it, but I can hear it. And so intelligent disobedience is refusing to go into the intersection because they know that that is contrary to their owner's goals. The same thing is true from an employee perspective. Ideally, your team members are pushing back when they're concerned about something. You may or may not go with what they recommend, but intelligent disobedience means they feel safe raising their hand to say, wait a minute, are you sure? And often they're right.
Yeah, I really like this concept. This is something that's so important for us. We also put in our job description, although we didn't use that terminology. But we just flat out said, not afraid to push back if you can see a valid reason why we're not going in the right direction. But as someone who loves being succinct, I love that concept of intelligent disobedience, because the moment you use those words, I knew exactly what you meant.
Nice. Yeah. And I put it in the pre-screen. So in the application, there's a question about, tell about a time when your boss was wrong and what did you do?
We have this. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. We have a similar question. It's actually not with reference to the team, but more with reference to clients. Okay. We just straight up say, because for us, our strategists, which was the role we are most recently hiring, they are the project manager, the content strategist, the marketing consultant, all in one. So they need to be able to push back and say no. And so we just straight up say, tell us about a time where you said no to a client. Why? How did it go? Give a sample, give an example. Yeah. And we have straight up had people who answered the tell us about a time you said no to the client, tell us a story in which they ended up saying yes to the client. And we had a few who they were otherwise really strong candidates, but it's like, no, you couldn't even say no. It's like the stories about them pushing back, but they're like, okay, so eventually I just like gave in. And it's like, okay, I'm really glad.
That wasn't the prompt.
Yeah, that wasn't the way exactly. It's like, that wasn't the prompt. This wasn't a trick question. This was really genuine.
And to be fair, it is hard. One of the
Yes.
things I'll use when I'm advising agencies, I have my 7 magic words to stop scope creep. And those 7 magic words are: a client asks you for something and it's not in scope. The words are: would you like an estimate for that?
Yeah, those truly are magic words, because that's pretty much exactly what we say, especially as a company that's subcontracting fairly often.
Yeah.
We have a policy that is, we will point out and hold boundaries strong over scope creep, but we will never like talk price or give them that number. Like, it'll just be like, okay, well, we can definitely do that for you. But that's going to be an additional cost. So I'm going to go talk and come back to you with what that'll cost. And people quite often, that just checks them a little bit. Another thing that we use quite often to tackle scope creep is the idea of a phase 2. If we're like, it doesn't matter if you pay us more, because that's not the best thing to do in this circumstance, right? We'll be like, wow, that's a great idea. We'd love to consider that for a phase 2. But here's why, we just want to keep to our timeline and to our budget for right now.
Makes sense. And ultimately, you're letting clients understand that it's out of scope and that it's not, that it's in their interest to defer things.
Yes,
So
and that's really it, in their interest. Yeah. Okay, I want to take us back a little bit to something that you mentioned, which is that in preparing for a recession, I think at this point we've all heard the insight, which is make sure that you're, reducing your outputs, putting aside money to cover expenses, ideally for a minimum of 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
But for, those of our listeners who maybe got caught with their pants down, and did not have 3 months in the bank, and maybe are like just starting to hit the levels they were at before, maybe just starting to kind of turn a profit again in a meaningful way. Basically, if a company doesn't have cash reserves, or has already, also a good situation to note, if they've gone through their cash reserves over the last 6 or 7 months, what are some means of staying afloat, minimizing debt, and just basically making effective decision making?
If you're in a dangerous or desperate financial situation, really the quickest way to cut expenses is unfortunately through layoffs or furloughs or other staff reductions. It's not fun, but consider that you're probably putting about half your revenue toward labor between owners, ongoing contractors, and employees. There isn't really much else you can cut. You certainly are spending a certain amount on rent, depending on your office situation, or if you own the building. But those aren't kind of an easy change to make. And so, unfortunately, people probably should be considering layoffs or furloughs if that's the situation. And it is worth considering. You need to operate in line with your values, but eventually you may have to decide, do we keep the team or do we risk going out of business? Like eventually you're gonna have to make some tough choices. And earlier in the year, one of my clients was considering layoffs and he decided not to. And it hurt him financially because he was effectively keeping people without having work for them to do, or at least not a commensurate level. And a couple months later, things were doing better and his best employee resigned. And he had, his frustration in our coaching was that he's like I took a hit to help keep people like her, yet she left anyway. And ultimately it's a tough decision. He had acted in line with his values at the time, but you can't guarantee what'll happen in the future. So if you're feeling financial pressure, eventually you may need to decide, do layoffs and or furloughs make sense? It may come down to the survival of the business versus whether you can maintain the team you'd like. For sure, if there's anyone on your team, I have this model that a friend shared, the idea of new rope versus wet twine. New rope are the amazing employees, drive things forward. Wet twine, tend to be more mediocre, and they require a lot of oversight relative to their low productivity. If anyone on your team is wet twine, and I have an article on this at the sakasandcompany.com website, why are you keeping them? If you had tons of money coming in, maybe you could afford to keep your wet twine team members. If things are more tenuous, like why are you keeping them? They're not helping you. They're not helping your agency move forward. Maybe start with them first. Because ultimately, as business owners, we have to consider a range of stakeholders. But if people have great intentions, but you go out of business, you won't be able to accomplish everything else you want to do.
That's very reasonable. Now, that being said, I think that layoffs can be a very emotional topic for people. And I know that decisions are often, even though we make every decision on an emotional level basis, whether we like it or not, emotions have a tendency to kind of cloud things. So are there any processes or templates, or how can you effectively make this decision if, let's say, you're not in an emergency situation where it's life or death for the business immediately and that's visible, or if, say, there are no immediately apparent members of the team who are contributing maybe at that mediocre level as opposed to high performer?
If it's to the point where you need to make cuts and you don't have any low performers, then you'll have to go after the mid performers. It's not an ideal situation. I have an article about strategic cost-cutting tiers. Tier 1 are smaller cuts that are mostly invisible to the team. Tier 2, it starts to hurt more, and Tier 3, it's significant layoffs. In my consulting work prior to COVID, in only about 1% of my client engagements did I recommend significant layoffs, usually because they were just in a really bad situation. That obviously has gone up somewhat, amidst COVID. But if someone is more, where it feels like maybe things are going okay, but you're not totally sure. Certainly don't stop selling. Continue your marketing and sales efforts. Continue developing your pipeline, because you will regret it later if you don't. And you may need to hold off on making new hires. It's like, let's try to get a bit more from the team now, rather than jumping to hire someone new. And importantly, call that out to the team to say, I know you're stressed out. I know you're feeling stretched. We all are. We need people to temporarily take on additional workload to help us avoid doing layoffs, but that also means we can't hire new people for at least a few months, or whatever the timeline is, and better to assume a bit longer than shorter on managing expectations. Then at least people realize that they're feeling overworked, and that you're not just callously doing it, that this is an intentional thing. It's not great, but at least when people know where you're coming from and you're communicating and over-communicating about it, they're not, filling in the worst possible assumption.
That makes sense. And this is something we've actually heard from the team again and again. We had a separate non-COVID related crisis basically the week that COVID hit. And so I was in the very difficult position of just needing to come clean with the team, or I decided to just come clean with the team and be like, look, this is hard for me to admit, but here's where we're at. This is what it means for you right now. That might change. And the response that we got from the team was actually overwhelming, in the sense that basically every single person reiterated that one of the things that they value about us the most is really that transparency, and not having it be, oh, hush, hush, behind closed doors, what the heck is going on? Right. But just really being real and being like, look, this is what we can tell it's going to look like. Here's what we're doing about it. And I had 2 people on the team privately come to me after that and offer support. in various forms, ranging from deferred payment, just confirming that, they'd be willing to work and continue working for some sort of deferred payment option or something like that. And I was just, for someone who was so terrified, because we think that I thought it was going to make me seem like weak and like I failed. And here are, because ultimately as that dictator of the business, whether or not I was personally responsible for whatever situation, it comes back to me. And I thought that I would be like losing respect and all of this different stuff. And lo and behold, it actually had the opposite effect, where we've really kind of pulled together and become much more tighter knit because of that. I'm very grateful for that. But I do want to reflect a little bit on what you said and not just kind of go off into my story, because what I've heard from you here is that the decision to make layoffs is never going to be easy. But while there are things that you can kind of do to put off that situation, the fact of the matter is that you're probably going to be taking a financial hit of one size or another if you defer that decision. So, and this is me extrapolating a little bit, but what I'm hearing is that if you're kind of in that middle position where it's not clear that you need to make layoffs to survive, that the first steps are maybe identifying, who on your team is essential, who is kind of a high performer, who maybe is, if we use the get it, want it, capacity to do it model, like is maybe not quite at the same level on one of those. And maybe I'm hearing, I know this is what we did at that time, do some, a little bit of like financial planning a bit, like maybe write down the numbers, see what people are costing you, see what's coming in, see what the gap between that is, and what your runway really actually looks like in real life. Is that something that you'd recommend?
Absolutely. And the thing about that, around making some of those tough decisions before it's too late, you'll have more runway if you make the decisions now rather than waiting a couple months. If you're, thinking from a personality perspective, like if someone's more of a non-confrontational person, it's going to be easy to try to put it off. And this may be a good time to get some outside perspective, whether that's through a coach or a consultant, or it could be through a friend, could be through someone else, to talk through what you're dealing with. And you may find that as you explain it to them, the answer becomes more clear. Or if you ask them for specific feedback, if you ask 4 people and they all suggest the same direction, and these, assuming these are people who know you and all that, it's worth paying attention to that. If, say 4 people say, go with option A and you want to do option B, if they know enough details, it's worth paying attention to that.
Yeah. And that is, that I will agree with that wholeheartedly. I know that has been a challenge for us in the past, is that confront, especially for, my chief of ops is incredible, but self-admittedly, she has some challenges around confrontation. And we have in the past, that has really come back and bit us in the butt, where we're like, okay, we'll just put off this decision. We'll give them another chance. We'll do this, we'll do that. And then next thing you know, you're really deep in a problematic situation. And, we have never once ended up less deep in the muck by deferring that decision. It has never once resolved itself in the way that we had hoped. It's
certainly would hope that everyone's listening. If you're in that situation right now and you're weighing, should I take action or not? I mean, from your experience, from my experience, I work with hundreds of agencies all over the world. Rip off the Band-Aid. It's going to hurt now, but it's going to hurt less now than it probably will later. Yeah. Yep. Could do a whole episode just on that dynamic around, or even just on layoffs and what that looks like, letting people go. It's such a painful thing. But it is one of the most important things as someone who runs a team, is the capacity to let people go. That is just the way it is, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, but as I kind of like wind us down a little bit here, so I'm curious, there's so much information out there. You yourself have a really amazing guide to coping through a continuing COVID. That's our term, not yours, that we will link in the show notes. But even that guide just has just so much information, it's almost overwhelming. So from your experience working with a lot of agency owners, I'm wondering whether
there's any advice that you have personally kind of given over and over and over again, or whether there's kind of a low-hanging fruit that a lot of people are missing, or a mistake that you often see people making. I'm just wondering if you can just give us like one or two pieces of insight that people can use in this overwhelming age of too much information.
Start by getting clear on where you want to go. As Stephen Covey said, begin with the end in mind. If you know where you want to go, you can work backwards from there. And I have a visioning tool that I've developed. I call it an advanced retrospective, where you write about as if it's the future before it already happened. So for instance, you could choose to write, 5 years from now. It's, today is December 31st, 2025, and it's a great day because, and you fill it in. It's a powerful tool in a few ways. One, you can understand where you want to go. You can share that with your team so they can support you in reaching those goals. It can also help you decide between multiple options. For instance, let's say you're considering whether to do a layoff or not. You could write about 5 years from now. Version 1 is, I did the layoff. And I'm so glad I did the layoff 5 years ago because, this and that. And then you could do a second version where you didn't do the layoff and you talk through that. And you're probably going to find that one of them is easier to write, maybe more enjoyable to write. I mean, layoffs are never a fun topic, but you can use that if you're considering 2 or 3 options. Write multiple advanced retrospectives. Today is pick a date sometime, 1+ year into the future, and compare which seems more fun. Then once you have that, you can enlist your team to help you get there. You can get advice from within your team or beyond to figure out how to make it happen. But if you don't have a clear picture about where you want to go, it's hard to get there and it's hard to get people to help. And you may also decide that you don't want to run your agency anymore. I have clients who've said, I don't love managing people. And managing people is a critical part of leading an agency. So if you don't want to manage people, being an agency leader probably isn't the right role for you. Like, there's no shame in winding down your agency. It's also worth considering, reflecting, how have you done on running your agency before? I recommend targeting net profit margins of 20 to 30%. If your agency has always struggled to break 10% in net profit margins, it's going to be harder now than ever before. And it's going to be harder to close that gap or try to get toward the 20 to 30% than previously. Do you want to go through with this? Or would you be happier working as an employee for somewhere else where you're not the sole decision maker about everything? It's okay. I mean, business ownership is tough. There's a reason that not everyone does it. And some people who are running their agency may decide it's not for them. That's okay. So ultimately, I guess the short version of the answer is understand where you want to go. And if getting there is going to take more than is a match for your values, goals, and resources, you may need to shift to something else, and that's okay.
I love that. I love that as a piece of insight. What I'm hearing from that is, number one, that the experience of writing can tell you something about your own preferences that maybe you're not already familiar with.
Yeah.
I think that's really important. I know when I have done this in other areas of my life, when I sat down and I was like, what is this going to look like? Especially relationships. What is this going to look like in 5 years? Do I want it? What that's going to look like in 5 years,
Right.
Just going through that process can provide us with the clarity that we may not have had, especially if we're, trying to pull the wool over our own eyes about a difficult decision.
Right.
But also I have heard again and again and again, and experienced personally, that the clearer you can make your vision, the easier it is to get there, because you're literally creating new pathways in your brain to put you on, the path to getting there.
Yeah.
And I'm also hearing that just in terms of it being an exercise, it helps pull us out of the immediate urgent space and into the longer term important but not urgent space of, this is what we're building, not this is how I'm reacting to the latest emergency.
Exactly. And I'll talk more about that in an upcoming event about designing your ideal agency. There are a couple events, if you're, I can share links to that if you're interested, about some upcoming things people might find helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have 2 or 3 events coming up in the next few weeks after this podcast that are already kind of slated to go into the show notes. So you mentioned that one of them is about creating kind of a vision for your agency. What are the other 1 or 2 if you want to
Yeah,
share?
so it's Design Your Ideal Agency. It's through Hey Orca, which makes social media software for agencies. That is October 21st. It's part of a multi-day series, 2020. If you're trying to figure out how to actually generate leads from your content, obviously people should talk to Anansi and get help. And then come to my October 28th training webinar, Upgrade Your Pipeline, Agency Lead Gen from Content Marketing. And looking a bit further ahead to December 2nd, I'm speaking through SharpSpring. It's Work Less, Earn More, Make Yourself Increasingly Optional at Your Agency.
Ooh, I like that one. I've been working on that one for several years now. And I found that the biggest barrier actually isn't the processes or the systems, it's the culture of nobody seems to really believe that it's actually possible.
It is possible.
But
I
it is possible.
a
Yeah, and
case
live and
study on
improve.
my site about an agency owner who's gone down to working to like 20 to 25 hours a week.
Yep, that's how much I work every week for over a year now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you have to want it, and then you have to
yeah.
make it happen. So I guess I could always come back for a future episode on the work less, earn more piece. But let
Yes.
come to the December 2nd Sharp Spring event in the meantime, and I'll share more about that.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I highly recommend it because it is awesome to not, drive yourself into the ground for your business. But in the meantime, as we wind down, we've already answered, a little bit of where people can tune in and find out more about you. Before we kind of complete that, I'm just curious, what gets you up in the morning other than coffee?
Well, the alarm clock that is helpful, but beyond that, I in my work I love helping agency owners. Often they're in over their heads. It could be that there's a lot of business coming in, but they're struggling from an operations perspective. It's like the wheels are falling off, kind of thing. And I've worked with hundreds of agencies. There's always something new, but I've got different patterns and frameworks and things to help organize things, listen actively, and identify custom advice for each agency. The way one client put it, I checked in at the beginning of the coaching call, and she was really stressed out. A lot going on, a lot of challenges, both personally and professionally. And we talked through things. I listened actively. I helped her triage and prioritize, helped recommend some specific solutions to move things forward. And when I checked in at the end of the call around how is she doing, she said that I had helped her calm the chaos.
Mm.
That made my week.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Calming the chaos, helping other people calm the chaos is so important in the world. So thank you.
Yeah.
And while you're calming the chaos, what is the number one thing you do to preserve your wellness and perhaps calm the chaos for yourself?
Mhm. Finding time to unplug from work, which is hard, right? When it's your own business, and also I want to help my clients. So whether that's taking a day off with zero email, or maybe a long weekend or something longer that's helpful. This year marks 20 years on and off of going to therapy,
Mm.
scheduling to get that massage. I guess really the theme is self-care, and self-care can look, it's different for each person. But ultimately, as business owners, we're busy focusing on everyone around us. It's put on your own oxygen mask first,
Yeah.
whatever
Take time for
self-care
you.
looks like for you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And for people who are maybe considering or feeling resistant to therapy or counseling, it is the ultimate time for you. Just putting
Yeah.
it out there. It's so, so, so powerful because you get to have an hour or whatever space of time with a professional that really is just for you and for whatever you're experiencing, whether that's to share or to dig in or to cry or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's such a gift to be able to take that for yourself.
And the longer you do it, the potentially the more it pays off, because you don't have to keep re-explaining.
Yes, as
Mention
someone who
blah,
has a
blah,
lot of
blah.
context, I
Yeah,
relate to that.
yeah,
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you, Karl. This has been just so valuable, so much insight. I encourage all of you guys listening, check out the events, check out the resources. In terms of people that we have, partnered with or interacted with or interviewed, few people have the sheer amount of content, frameworks, processes, and usable material available for free to help agencies than Karl does. So would you be willing to tell the audience, other than what we've already talked about, where they can find out more about you, where they can check out anything else you might have for them?
Sure. Well, visit my website. I have hundreds and hundreds of free articles. You can also get my newsletter. That website is sakasandcompany.com, S as in Sam, AKASAND, the word company.com. If you're on Twitter, I'm at Karl Sakas. That's KarlSakas, at Karl Sakas on Twitter. And I also do monthly office hours every month, the second Tuesday of the month. It's an hour of free advice. If you're interested in my answering a question free of charge, you can submit that in advance. I pre-pick some questions that I know will help a range of agencies. And there's even time to answer even more, live. So I love helping agencies. I like helping people figure out the right solution for them, based on their unique values, goals, and resources. So there's tons of free stuff. And if you'd like further help, glad to chat, but check out the free stuff first at sakasandcompany.com.
Excellent. Thank you, Karl, for such an amazing session. And to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day.